All right, this is the presentation. I'll refer to the page numbers as I go through. Thank you all for being here tonight. And this is our first budget workshop of the year. The goal here is to kind of start to set the context for our budget process, get an early look at some things that need to be on our radar. If you look on page 2. So what we're going to do now, I'll talk briefly about the enrollment components, budget components. We'll talk briefly about enrollment projections and some state funding estimates and a legislative update. We've also got Mr. Ralph Williams here, who is going to talk about an RFP we've received for transportation services. We'll then turn it over to the principals, who will talk about capital special projects, and Coach Kraft will be here also to talk about some athletic needs. And then we'll finish up with a public forum. The public forum, since this is a budget meeting, comments need to stay on budget. Anything that's not budget related, our regular meeting is next Tuesday. Okay, so let's jump right in and let's look at revenue and the components that go into revenue. What you'll see on page 4, the two drivers of our revenue are our student enrollment and our local property values. And you'll see here a breakdown. This is from what we budgeted this year. You'll see about 2/3 of our general fund revenue comes from local property taxes. The next biggest chunk is state funding, which is almost 1/3. That little tiny sliver is the federal funding, and that's almost all SHARS reimbursements. And then the last section there is other revenue. That would be miscellaneous revenue, athletic revenue, sale of property, sale of equipment, things like that. And then as far as enrollment goes, we talked about this a little bit at the last board meeting. We're coming off a 5-year period where we were seeing declining enrollment. It flattened out this last year. It actually ticked up about 23 students. That was a 1% increase. We're not comfortable at this point calling that a trend, because 1 year doesn't make a trend, because there is a strong relationship between oil prices and our enrollment. We've looked at that a little bit. Oil prices would have to get above $58 a barrel before we would expect to start seeing that bump. We're not seeing that right now. So we're expecting flat enrollment for next year. That's what we're going to build our budget on, is a projection. We're not going to project decrease in student enrollment. We're not going to project an increase when we're building the budget this year. So, local property values. We will get our preliminary values on April 30th. That's when we'll have some pretty good numbers. We'll get our certified values on July 25th. Now, I met with Burton Jones, and Doug was there too last week, just to get an early preview. Says we may see a little bit of an increase on the oil and gas revenue side, not expecting much on the actual property values. So we may see a little bump, but we're not anticipating a big bump there. So what does that mean? Well, state funding is driven by our property values, and they're driven by last year's property values. When property values go up, then our state funding goes down. When property values go down, our state funding goes up. Last year, our revenues went up about $64 million. That means this year, based on current numbers, if our enrollment doesn't change at all, we're looking at our state funding decreasing by about $580,000. How do we compensate for that? 2 quick ways. One, we get 100 extra kids. That'll make up the game. The other way is our property values bump up about $55 million. So if we see about a $55 million bump in property values this year at the current tax rates, that'll also put us back revenue neutral compared to this year. That make sense? Okay.
And that's not a huge number based on...
That's not a huge number. It's less than we saw last year. So we'll know a lot more in 2 weeks when we see those preliminary values. So it's I would see this as a yellow flag. I wouldn't see it as a red flag yet. So let's wait till we get those property values to see what those are. Okay. The big driver, of course, this year, we're up to page 13 now, is going to be, we're in a legislative session. And there's a lot of activity going on right now that could substantially affect our funding this year. There are two major bills out there, one filed and passed the House. House Bill 3 passed last week with 143 to 1 vote, and it was sent to the Senate. And that is a very positive bill for the district, for most of the state. And I'm going to break down this in a little bit. But the bottom line on that, the legislative runs I've seen say that if House Bill 3 were to pass by the Senate exactly as it is with no changes, we would be looking at an increase in revenues next year somewhere between $800,000 and $1.4 million. That's a very positive thing. Of that, the extra revenue, 25% of that would be earmarked for staff raises, and the rest of the district would have discretion over how to spend it. Now, the Senate bill, not quite as friendly. We'll go through and we'll look at that. Let's just go through. Overall funding, House Bill 3 adds an extra $6.3 billion. The Senate bill only adds $3.89 billion, and a big chunk of that is earmarked for a $5,000 across-the-board mandated teacher pay raise. Now, that sounds really good, except the House bill changes the formulas, which means it's in there permanently. The Senate bill doesn't change the formula, it just gives us money for 2 years. And there's no promise that in year 3 that money is still there. And without that money being there in year 3, we're suddenly on the hook of having to cut the budget by about $1.2 million in 1 year, because that's how much we could potentially lose in that 1 year. So that's a caution, we have to take that with a grain of salt there. And that's because the Senate bill changes the basic allotment. It adds almost $900 to the basic allotment. That's the money we get per kid, and that's a number that's then multiplied throughout the rest of the formula to drive our total number. The Senate bill has not said how much it will increase the basic allotment. There's language in there that they might increase it. No promises have been made. Both bills do provide for full-day pre-K for eligible four-year adults. And by eligible, that typically means economically disadvantaged by whatever definition the bill uses for economically disadvantaged. The House bill does give us 6 years to start providing that service. I will say, full-time daycare for 4-year-olds right now, we probably don't have the space to do it. Probably could not do that in the first year. Not without moving portable buildings. I don't see any way to get that done. Property tax compression. The House bill would provide $2.7 billion in tax reduction by compressing us from $1.04 to $1. So everybody would see a 4-cent decrease in their local property taxes. It also changes the yield, the guaranteed yield for each level of taxing that we do. The Senate bill just contains current law. It doesn't change anything. I'm not going to get into discussing gold and copper pennies unless somebody really has a question. When I say gold pennies, I'm talking about our tax rate up to $1.07. Copper is from $1.08 on up to $1.17. And they have different guaranteed yields. We're guaranteed that if we levy that penny, we are guaranteed a certain amount of money from the state. If we don't earn that much of our local taxes, they send us state revenues to compensate for it. That's what a guaranteed yield means. So,
But if House Bill 3 passes, does that change the whole formula since it gets compressed?
And the fundamental formula is they change the golden penny. Right now, the golden pennies are tied to the yield of Austin ISD. Both bills would take it away from Austin ISD. The House bill indexes it to the 96th percentile or 160% of basic allotment. The Senate bill delinks it, but it hasn't said what they're going to make it to. So we don't know.
Okay.
Also, on the copper pennies, they increase it from $31.95 up to 80% of the basic allotment on the House side. Senate side does not specify yet. Recapture, it would reduce recapture in the House bill by about 38%. To put that in perspective, Canadian legislative run showed they would be paying about $2 million less in recapture next year under the House bill. Now, we're not currently in recapture, but it certainly lowers the possibility that we go back into recapture. Senate bill hasn't determined what they're going to do with that. Blended learning is in both bills. If you don't know what blended learning is, that's when you mix online and face-to-face instruction in the classroom. Both bills encourage that through grant programs and development materials. Teacher incentives. There are some limited teacher incentives in both of them for critical need areas. And of course, the Senate does have that $5,000 across-the-board pay raise for teachers and librarians. That's in Senate Bill 3, not Senate Bill 4. They have to pass both of them. H Bill 3 doesn't specify salary increases other than earmarking that 25%, which works out, according to the state's numbers, to about an $1,800 per employee pay raise. The House bill does not have any funding that's tied to testing. The Senate bill does have funding tied to testing. It's related to third grade reading and some funding for those who struggle with that third grade test. Both of them look at changing the comp ed. Compensatory education, the House bill sets up multiple weights and gives us additional ways to identify our students for comp ed. And the way our comp ed funding is done, we take the average of the last 6 months of the number of kids who are on free or reduced lunch. That's how we currently calculate it. That's how the Senate would continue to calculate it. The House version would give us a few extra ways to identify those kids, which could increase the number of kids we identify and increase that funding a little bit. Both bills remove the gifted and talented allotment, so that would no longer exist. Both put some requirements on school boards. The House bill requires school boards to develop 5-year early childhood literacy plans and mathematics proficiency plans. And schools must set annual and quantifiable goals for student performance. This board has already done that, so you guys are ahead of the game. We'd have to look at early childhood literacy, but we've got a lot of those done. The Senate plan is tied to something called the 60 by 30 Texas goals. And we would have to develop a plan to achieve those goals. And this might be the first time some of you have heard about those goals, so we'll flip to the next page. I'm not even close to where I'm supposed to be. I haven't been clicking. Jeremy, you should be clicking. Okay, so what are the 60 by 30 goals? There are 4 goals set by the state. One is to develop, and we're on page 21 now. Goal 1 is to develop an educated population, and what they're looking at is they're measuring the percent of Texans who have a post-secondary credential. That would include people migrating to the state from other states and people raised here in the state. And the goals focus on 25 to 34-year-olds. And you can see the goals here. Right now, we're sitting at around 43.5%. The goal is by 2030 to have it up to 60%. That's where you get in your 30-60s. The second goal has to do with the number of credentials, number of people completing credentials in institutions of higher education each year. It targets all students in higher education. They break it down into groups by ethnicity, gender, and economically disadvantaged, and each of those subgroups has their own goal. And the goal here is by 2030 to have 550,000, whereas right now we're at 341,000 certificates and diplomas being issued. The third goal has to do with marketable skills, and this includes, I don't know how they're going to measure this, interpersonal, cognitive, and applied skill areas that are valued by employees. And the goal is that we're going to get up to, and it's not clear on this slide, I apologize. The goal is to get from 75%, which is where we currently are, at 80%. And the last goal is to reduce student debt. And the goal here is to make sure that no one who graduates with an undergraduate has student loan debt that exceeds 60% of their wages. Seems like a pretty high number. So, those are the goals.
60? 60?
60. Now, these are not goals that currently the district, or very many districts in Texas, are working on. So the Senate bill were to pass. These are things that would suddenly become very much part of our vernacular as we start building our goals. The House bill does not focus on this. On page 25, back to the legislation, House Bill 3 has a requirement that before schools could seek voter approval to raise their tax rates, they would have to have an efficiency audit conducted on the district and pass that. Details are not really out on that yet, except the district would have to pay for that cost. The Senate bill does not have that. Both of them include dyslexia and dual language weights. Both bills extend the CTE programs into junior high. The House bill takes it down to 6th grade. The Senate bill takes it down to 8th grade. And there are some adjustments to the new instructional facility allotments and the small and mid-sized adjustments. Those are adjustments made for very small and mid-sized schools. We are a mid-sized school. There is a factor that gets multiplied all the way through the formulas. They're moving that outside of the formulas and making the standalone allotment, which will reduce the amount of money we get from that particular allotment. But, like I said, in the House bill side, we still net a positive even with the losses. And finally, both bills are going to repeal the cost of education index. Both are going to repeal the high school allotment. Both are going to repeal the staff allotment. The staff allotment is just a few $100s. It's a very tiny allotment. They're also going to phase out the Chapter 41 hold harmless and early agreement credits. And both are going to replace transportation linear density calculations with per mile allotment. And Chapter 41 schools will be eligible for that. The only difference with the Senate is that the Senate would switch to current year values. Remember I said that our school funding is based on last year's property values. The Senate wants to switch it to current year values. Lieutenant Governor Patrick says that will save $1.8 billion. By save, that means it will extract $1.8 billion from education from Texas. So let's say that for what it is. TA is also told the Senate that it is not feasible to do that. That we just can't get this year's values in time and have it certified by the state to even use those numbers. But that is still a major point of contention and is still a goal for the team. Okay. And that summarizes those bills. I went very quickly. Are there any questions? Nope. Okay. Then I'm going to move on. I'm going to introduce Ralph Williams, who's going to talk about the transportation RFP.